From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
We've returned. So how about that second question? We've answered why and how asbestos is bad for humans. Why wasn't the public aware of these risks? There's no way around this, folks. Scientists had clearly linked asbestos to cancer right around the 1930s, right around the same time doctors made real progress in understanding mesothelioma. And some of the progress they made was figuring out, oh, hey, this is pretty much only caused by asbestos. Like the vast majority of these cases are from people who have been exposed to this one substance. And at the same time, this evidence began to grow, the influence of very powerful asbestos companies grew as well. Like, make no mistake, you don't maybe hear about them too often in the news, but mining companies are a big deal. They have a lot of political clout in various countries, and they have a lot of financial power because people are hooked on what they provide from the earth or what they take from the earth.
You're literally pulling money out of the ground.
Hashtag Black Monday murders. Over the course of 4 decades, if you look at the period from the 1940s to the 1980s, this group, I don't want to call them a cabal, but this group of manufacturers in the asbestos industry, they grew their business into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They employed hundreds of thousands of people, and they knew good and goddamn well that their success depended upon keeping the problems with asbestos a secret for as long as possible. Not a conspiracy theory, actual conspiracy. They conspired. They did it. You can see a solid timeline for this on asbestos.com. There is one problem, though, or not problem, but there's a thing you should know about asbestos.com. It is a for-profit entity. It is there to help you file legal claims for asbestos-related conditions. Still, looking into their research and what they've gathered, even though, of course, they would be a biased source, their research is sound. They know what they're talking about. If you look at their timeline, which is available for free online, it starts around 1858 with the founding of Johns Manville, an asbestos manufacturer that will go on to become the top dog in the world in this thing. And therefore, they were on the front lines of the cover-up.
Yeah, it really is devastating to actually look at the entire timeline that they've got there at asbestos.com. I would say it's very strange to me that within their timeline, they jumped from 1949 to 1962, and there's nothing in the 1950s. And one of the main reasons is because the 1950s was boom time for putting asbestos in things. It was like, let's go, boys, get that asbestos in there as quick as we can, I guess. And nobody was worried about, anything else.
Well, let's not forget, too, Ben, you mentioned that the town of Asbest in Russia has a sculpture made out of asbestos. So this really was a super versatile material. Like, if you look at some of these documentaries we're talking about, you'll see people showing you little artifacts and little trinkets made of asbestos and handling them like it's no big deal.
Yep, exactly. Kind of the same way people would drink out a leaded glass with no worries. You know what I mean? We see that this timeline, as you guys mentioned, it's uneven. It has some gaps, but it does generally map out in detail actions by various leaders of industry to suppress the information, to keep it from the public. And they were at this for a very long time. And back in 1929, a group of asbestos manufacturers contacted a guy named Dr. Anthony Lanza, who was a medical director at Metropolitan Life Insurance, which we'll get to in a second, asked them to investigate disease among asbestos factory workers. And he came back and he said, hey, you know, these guys all show incredibly high rates of asbestos related diseases. And they were like, cool, thanks for playing, Doc. And then they buried his results. They suppressed it. They probably had him sign something agreeing that he wouldn't talk about this. Metropolitan Life Insurance would go on to actively participate in the cover-up to help swindle employees out of medical care, to deny their claims and so on. They also manipulated studies to downplay the seriousness of some conditions. Over across the pond in the UK, a manufacturer called Turner and Newell convinced, cough, cough, bribed, cough, cough, British officials to like limit regulations and dial back any safety inspections. It wasn't until like 1964 or so that the tide started turning. And that is sadly because a lot of people saw someone they knew die or be afflicted with some mysterious lung condition. And word on the street, everybody in a given region knew if you live near this mine, if you live in this town, you have much higher likelihood of not just getting a cancer or a kind of cancer, but a short list of very specific ones. And so this is when asbestos manufacturers did what corporate America calls a pivot. They got out in public and they said, we're as surprised as you. We had no idea. And some people believed them, and maybe they were convincing, but later internal memos from these companies talking with themselves, like multiple companies conspiring, and court paperwork, depositions, they all proved this was a lie. There's one Bendix Corporation employee from 1966 who wrote, you know, if you've enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to laugh. It's just
it's terrible.
It's brilliant copywriting is what it is. But it's also inherently nihilistic and missing the point, kind of, you know. One of the experts in one of the documentaries I watched, I think it was the Vice one, said how at this scale, if a company knows what they're putting out in the world is going to kill you, then they are committing mass murder. They may not know who it's going to kill or when it's going to kill them, but if they're, you know, maintaining that level of negligence, you know, in favor of profit over, you know, human rights, then they are in fact mass murderers.
Well, let's talk about the Bendix concept really quickly, the one that you just mentioned there, Ben, with regards to all of this. Imagine that you are working for a company and you've been working there for a long time. You've been making pretty good money. You've been supporting, let's say, your family, right? And you're continuing to make pretty good money. You find out that by working there, by exposure to whatever chemical you're dealing with, you are likely going to die at some point from a disease it's going to cause inside of you. You can make and if you're informed with that information, you can make the decision to continue working there, to continue to support your family until you do eventually die. And that is one thing for me. That's one decision, right? What if you find out that you're not the only one that's going to die in your family because you're doing that, that maybe everybody in your family is going to be exposed to the same stuff because they're using the products. It's not just the manufacturing process. It's also the use of the product. Like that to me is a whole different, it's just
level
a whole
of ethical quandary.
Yes.
But wasn't it not until like the 2000s even that like the World Health Organization actually made a stand on this, or that it was, you know, really kind of considered verboten? Because I have distinct memory of going to this high school. I've mentioned this before, where it was an old building and we got a new school, brand new shiny school, and everyone, you know, moved to the new school. But the old school was known to be an asbestos hazard, and there was all of this like efforts to do this asbestos removal. So this wouldn't have been in the 2000s. This was probably in like the mid 90s. So when did the public consciousness really shift and like cancel asbestos in the United States, Ben?
In the United States, the first lawsuits date back to 1971. Which is still almost a century after those concerns were first raised. And court evidence has gone on to show that multiple companies contributed knowingly to this. Some had, like we said, buried research. Others had kept information from their employees, like to the point where you'd have to see the company doctor and the company doctor wouldn't show you your x-rays, and you would just be, they would just have you continue working as normal until you died or were physically unable, to breathe well enough to work the mine.
Okay, so it was 1978 when the United States officially banned asbestos. Mm-hmm. But because it had been used for so long, that means that all of these homes were just chock full of asbestos, like my high school. And so then asbestos removal became a whole industry. And I think off air, Ben, you were mentioning how it's like one of the least regulated, like, any schmuck can like be an asbestos removal technician. And I mentioned that in The Sopranos, there was a subplot where they were running a racket for asbestos removal because, the idea would be, remove it from the place, but then you got to do something with it so it's not further contaminating, other people's water supplies or whatever. It needs to be dealt with in some sort of, particular way. But in the show, they just dumped it into like the East River. Isn't it interesting though how science kind of creates a thing that is then used, and then science has to create a solution, and it's also wrapped up in industry and just money making, and so corners get cut, and we're probably still dealing with the fallout from asbestos today.
Absolutely, yeah. If we look back at this timeline, we know that once Johns Manville became the #1 manufacturer of this substance, we can actually do something I usually don't like to do, which is to put a face on a nefarious corporate activity. But we'll give you a single person to think about. His name is Lewis H. Brown. The scientific term for him would be a real piece of shit. In 1984, there was this deposition where these different attorneys and officials were describing a meeting that had occurred between Lewis H. Brown, an attorney for Johns Manville called Van Diver Brown, no relation, I believe, and officials from another firm making asbestos called UNARCO. And this guy, Charles Romer, is talking this deposition, and he recalls interchange Lewis Brown had about his employees' health. And he says, quote, "I'll never forget. I turned to Mr. Brown. One of the Browns made this crack that UNARCO managers were a bunch of fools for notifying employees who had asbestosis. And I said, 'Mr. Brown, do you mean to tell me that you would let them work until they drop dead?' He said, 'Yeah, we save a lot of money that way.'"
Ooh.
Just straight out said it,
In a deposition?
No, the Romer is saying this in a deposition. Brown's not there.
Okay, sorry.
No, I don't think he had quite that level of chutzpah.
Okay, I'm not even going to take it back because I was confused because the level of chutzpah this guy had almost would be the kind of thing where he'd be like, "Yeah, I did it, of course." What else was I going to do? You got to make money.
Ask
what
the
am I going to
shareholders.
Yeah, what am I going to be
Exactly.
poor? I'm going to be a poor.
I swear, if I have to go from being super rich to just rich, I'm going to kill myself.
And he's like,
Mr.
And he's
Show.
like,
Yeah.
he's like, "Your Honor, I dismiss this case." And the judge is like, "That's not how courts work, bro."
You don't get that luxury. So this is really just kind of like, Ben, to your point, kind of like a little bit of a snapshot of how callous some of the people at the top were. They knew people were dying. They absolutely didn't care. When the public outcry led to all of these lawsuits, the government finally did take action and impose regulations. And like I said, in 1978, the stuff was outright banned. And now when we think of asbestos, what do we think of? We think of the bad stuff. We think of it's the stuff, this legacy stuff that was in everything and now is like a boondoggle on our, public health. Asbestos removal continues to this day.
Oh yeah,
it is still because there's so many buildings. Think, we can't really understate how ubiquitous this stuff was. It's like if all of a sudden a toilet became a toxic thing. Just the concept of the toilet. I was in New York recently on vacation. I was like, for some reason, because I do dumb things like this, I was like, I wonder how many toilets there are in New York City. It's a lot. It's going to be a lot.
Yeah.
And with asbestos, it's not even only in one product. It's in all of these building materials. So the idea of asbestos removal is a generational concept, they're going to keep doing it.
Wouldn't it be funny if Johns Manville was the #1 worldwide asbestos removal corporation in 2022?
Ooh.
That's a pivot. That's a serious. Yeah.
That's the Ouroboros of capitalism.
Yeah. We infected everyone, we exposed everyone to asbestos, and now we see the error of our ways. And also, it happened to align with a real good money-making scheme of removing the asbestos that we put into the world.
I mean, well, good advertising is always about creating a need instead of identifying it. And we do want to point out, for example, when I said at the top that people, you were probably personally affected by this in some way. Just for an example from our own lives, the building in which our office is based, Ponce City Market, had to get a deep clean to remove lead-based paint and asbestos. And I do want to say the people who are working in the asbestos removal industry right now are doing a good thing, and it's not easy, and it is dangerous, and it's not really an operation with an end in sight, because there's so much there. In a very real way, the current generations are paying for the mistakes of generations past, and other companies definitely helped with this. There are still lawsuits continuing. If we look at asbestos today, right now, like in this year, asbestos will kill 12,000 to 15,000 people in the U.S. alone. Oh, people in Johns Manville, by the way, pulled a Sackler. They didn't go to jail. You don't go to jail when you're at that level.
They never do. No, you don't. And just to answer a question that I asked a while ago, like when you do dispose of asbestos, it's not like it's disappearing. The whole point of this stuff was like plastics and microplastics or whatever. It doesn't really decay. It doesn't biodegrade. So they really just have to like seal it in containers, sort of like nuclear waste, and then put it in an asbestos disposal site, which essentially, I guess at that point becomes a Superfund site, or it's like a toxic hazardous waste disposal thing like Yucca Mountain or something,
So make no mistake, this is a genuine multi-generational conspiracy of the most common and disappointing sort. There's nothing occult going on here. There's no weird spiritual thing. It's just people who had money and wanted more money and didn't care about who died as a result.
This is the quintessential conspiracy. There's the Occam's razor of conspiracies. We don't need there to be some spooky ulterior motive. It just makes sense. Oh, there's a thing that people want to buy that we can sell for a long time. Oh, it kills them a little bit. It's fine. They won't figure that out for a while. Let's just keep draining them of their cash for as long as possible. And then when the public outcry becomes large enough, we'll pivot and then be like, oops, sorry. And then we're fine.
We're as surprised as you are. And this, by the way, this is not ancient history. As we had mentioned before, while there are no active asbestos mines here in the U.S. where we record this show, there are plenty of asbestos mines around the world now, especially as we foreshadowed, in Russia. Noel, you and Matt and I watched that Vice documentary we mentioned several times. Where you can also see some pretty harrowing studies about what's going on there. But asbestos manufacturing, open pit mining of asbestos, is alive and well with our neighbors in Russia.
Well, I mean, I mentioned that they are so proud of it. Again, there's a term I learned in that Vice documentary. It's called a monotown, which we have these in the United States as well. When the housing market collapsed, a lot of places in the Midwest and even in here in the South that exclusively existed to do, say, carpet manufacturing or certain things that were specifically for housing or construction, they just absolutely their unemployment rates were near 100%. And in Russia it is the same, but it's not even regulated. I mean, none of this stuff is regulated because it's all the behest of Putin. They really don't care about human rights or public health exactly in the same way. I mean, maybe there's a calculus they do to make sure that their whole population doesn't die out. It reminds me a lot of what happened with Chernobyl, where, there was this absolute public health catastrophe that took place, but they didn't announce it for a long time, a very long time, the amount of time that led to a huge amount of people getting exposed to radioactive fallout. And if you've seen the Chernobyl, miniseries on HBO or read much about it, you understand that it becomes this almost like 1984 kind of mentality where it's like, we don't make mistakes. So if something went wrong, it didn't really go wrong. You know what I mean?
Right. Like it would be, there's a really good look at this when we see Stalin era stories where, I recently watched a film that was kind of a critical bomb, but it had Tom Hardy and Gary Oldman in it. And it's about attempting to find a serial killer in the USSR. And the whole problem is that Stalin has decreed murder as a capitalist crime. So they're not allowed to investigate homicides because they don't
happen here.
Right. Exactly. And this is very, very dangerous. Yeah. And we know that people have been trying to get asbestos out, to get the message out. And industries have been also, in their defense, they've been working to limit asbestos use. And, asbestos removal, as you said, is an industry all its own. But I found this really interesting quote from a guy named Jock McCullough. And he said the following: "The industry's survival has been largely due to its success in keeping alive the fiction that asbestos can be used safely. Arguably, its most potent weapons have been the suppression of evidence about the hazards of asbestos and even the corruption of science aimed to promote doubt about the mineral's toxicity." This interview is not from the 1960s. Matt, Noel, this interview is from 2006. The problem is real. The problem is huge. It is still here. And at this point, we said this episode was going to be a bummer. Here's why. First, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have died. More will die this year and the year after that. But secondly, there's not really a clear, easy solution. There's not a way to undo the consequences of this conspiracy. No, I would even say at this point, we pass the torch to our fellow conspiracy realists. We want to hear what you think. I would not be surprised if we have friends in the audience today who themselves work in some branch of the asbestos removal industry, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know anybody personally, but it absolutely is a thing that continues to be one of those dirty jobs they talk about. But this is probably not one that they really have done an episode on because it is so heavy. And it is an example of like, oh, no one else will do this job. Well, I'll do it. It probably pays a decent hourly wage, but at what cost? At least here, I mean, when in that documentary on Vice, when they're in the town of Asbest, they talk to people that work at the mines and they don't wear any protective gear. They borderline don't even acknowledge the dangers of the stuff. And then there's a few scientists that they interviewed, from Russia who are like, the most telling one was there's a scientist who was actually contracted by the World Health Organization to do research on asbestos effects in the town of Asbest. And the vice journalist point blank just said, so there's people in this town that live near an open pit mine, an open asbestos pit mine. Is asbestos dangerous? And this like super cool, calculated, like company man Russian scientist says, well, life is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
That's about as dismissive as you can get.
Yeah, it's definitely an answer to a different question. Russia is by far the world's largest producer of asbestos today. The second place would be Kazakhstan. Russia makes 790,000 metric tons. Kazakhstan makes 210,000 metric tons. At least that's what they did last year. And the numbers don't seem set to go down anytime soon because industries still use this stuff. So at this point, folks, we've laid out the case. We want to hear from you. What is to be done? What should be done? What's your take? And then are there stories of other substances like asbestos that have been the subject of multi-generational conspiracies, corruption, and cover-ups? Let us know. We try to be easy to find online.